This is my first time posting here on this sub, so go easy on me. Before I begin my story, I've been a long-time lurker, and I feel like it's finally time to share my story. I'm a male, late 30s. I'm also a military officer. I've been deployed to Iraq 3 times. I have also completed several tours in Afghanistan as well. I don't scare easily, and I'm quite aware of my surroundings. Because of this, I have been able to see things that most people cannot. I'm not sure if it's because of my experiences in combat, or if these things are just common in my life. Anyhow, I'm from Flagstaff, Arizona, and up until very recently, lived there full time. When I was younger, I had heard multiple stories about Skinwalkers from the older generation in my community. They claimed that these beings were evil witches who could turn into animals, specifically coyotes, deers, and wolves. Those creatures are considered to be sacred by some American Indian regions. So, it's believed that when somebody becomes a skinwalker, they give up their humanity forever for the sake of dark magic. I never really gave much thought to these stories until I was about 19. My friend and I were on a weekend trip to Sedona, Arizona. We decided to stay the night in an abandoned building on top of one of the Red Rocks. You know, urban exploration, many moons ago. It was just wide enough for all 4 of us to slide in. This was our first mistake, and also, right before I was about to hit boot camp. We were obsessed with urban exploration, although I wonder if you could hardly call this one urban exploring. It was roughly 5 a.m., and we all woke up to the sound of coyotes howling and growling outside the building. I'm not sure what exactly compelled us to stay, but after a few minutes, it began to sound like they were getting closer and far more aggressive. We made the decision then to leave, quickly. As we were leaving, something was following us. I don't really know how to describe it in my mind. I'm not even sure if it was a skinwalker, but we felt that we were in danger. It felt that we were not wanted there, like we were somehow trespassing, if that makes any sense. My friends and I all ran back to the car, eventually driving away, but they followed us. We finally lost them, after turning off the main road, driving through some back roads before getting back to the main highway. I'm still not very sure if this was a skinwalker or not, but I can tell you one thing. We got back to the hotel, and my friends were so shaken up over this. My friend claims he actually saw eyes, these golden eyes. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely something dangerous. It felt like we weren't wanted there, that we were in danger the entire morning, even after we left. At first, my friend thought he might just be daydreaming, or that he might have panicked. He says he felt something was stalking him later on, and he swears he could feel like he was being watched wherever he went. He's still convinced to this day that it followed him back to Arizona after we left. I was stationed in Yuma afterwards, and he in Flagstaff. He claims that he has now been marked. I work as a Marine, stationed at Mountain Desert Island in Maine. I've been stationed here for nearly 3 years now. I have always loved the place. I grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marines when I was shortly 21. The area here is just so different than where I'm from. It feels like the perfect way to show my appreciation to America and all its beauty. What's weird about this job, though, is how it kind of ruins your other jobs and the lifestyles there. Like, being a Marine is so different. Everything else just seems so mundane after this, as we're deployed or on vacation back home. Anyway, one thing that really gets me is the wildlife here. Not some of it, but all of it. It leaves me wondering what's out here sometimes, if you know what I mean. Look, I know this might sound cliche, but the only thing we have in common with most of these animals is that they can be found on Earth, unlike what I'm about to tell you about. It makes me think that some really freaky things are out here. Last year itself was pretty bad. There were many strange things going on, it's really hard to keep track of everything. Now, a couple of things stand out. The first thing that really stood out was on a very clear night. Our patrol unit noticed a figure moving near the woodline. We knew there were no other units out there within that position, so we all assumed it was possibly a large buck, and we continued on our patrol without any more thought. However, one of our own guys, Lance Corporal Cray, had decided to investigate the movement since we had extra time before heading back to base. He was gone for a few moments before we finally heard gunshots from the position that he went to investigate. We all freaked out, ran to help him, thinking that the worst had happened. As we got closer, though, our radios picked up Cray frantically telling us not to come any closer. He informed us to call base and get a chopper there ASAP. He claimed that something was hunting him, and we had to get help. Surprisingly, base actually listened to us, and they sent an entire chopper there immediately. We got Cray out of there, but he was pretty shaken up. Told us it wasn't a deer like he initially thought, more like some sort of wolf creature, only bigger than any wolf I have ever heard of. He told us it walked upright and had the face of a dog with teeth that were reminiscent of a large saber-toothed cat. He told us that this thing had eyes like dark, hot coals. While many of us did not believe him, we thought he was pranking us, putting on a great acting performance. He was pretty traumatized by it and seemed shaken up. And this was not a man who was a nonsense kind of guy. He was never a jokester. In fact, Cray was a very serious, very stern kind of guy. I don't even think the man ever laughed in his life. You know, one of those kinds of guys. So for this to happen to him, it was disturbing. That wasn't all, though. Not by a long shot. On our last patrol of the year, we were making our way back to base. I had just finished the morning patrol in the woods when I noticed this sound lingering in the air. It was this strange mechanical buzzing and sounded like something was coming my way. So I quickly hid in the bushes, but nothing came. I then resumed heading back to base. The sound still persisted, sounding like it was coming from every which direction, but I could never find any signs of what was making it. This went on for roughly 20 minutes before finally stopping. Part of me really does wonder if it's aliens after all. I've never seen it in my life until I got stationed here. They're just stories though, right? Maybe somebody's screwing around or playing pranks on us. These things couldn't possibly be real, could they? I have worked as a mechanic in the military, as well as serving a short time in military intelligence. What I'm about to share is absolutely true and happened roughly 20 years ago. I worked on a small crew that maintains and repairs all the military mechanized equipment in our battalion. We had just finished our weekly maintenance checks on every vehicle we own, and we got word from one of our forward operating bases, also commonly referred to as FOB, nearby, about some suspicious activities. A few of our men, who were patrolling the mountainside, they recently got intel that some enemy combatants are attempting to establish a recent base camp in the area. The mountains located near the FOB are very dense, lots of caverns and thick forest. It's nearly impossible to see inside of them without getting close enough. We received word from one of the men who was on patrol that we were able to get close enough to one of these caves. Apparently, he had seen some strange-looking figures inside. What he thought were enemy combatant spies were something far else. He was scared and fled, leaving his squad. We ended up getting a few of us together and took our best sniper with us, as well as all of our equipment. Not only were we going to do a thorough scout of the perimeter, but plan to take care of any combatants we find. We took every safety precaution necessary, planning our attack accordingly. We went up to where the men on patrol told us they saw these figures in order to spy on them, thinking it could have been them. We were able to get very close without being detected. It was very dark. That's when we saw them for the first time. But they were moving around in a circle, slowly. They looked like large, hairy humanoids. They had no clothes on, and fur as thick as a grizzly bear. These were large, hairy, beastly things. Cone-shaped heads, no neck. Massive, broad shoulders. The sight alone was terrifying. It was then that we realized they weren't enemy combatants. They weren't even humans. They were doing something we didn't understand. We were terrified by the sight, and all came to a mutual understanding. We were seeing Bigfoot creatures. This is when we decided to leave the area before we would engage these things. My buddy, who was a sniper, had the safety off his gun, ready to shoot. I stopped him. We sat there observing them for as long as we could, before deciding to leave and report back. We told our superiors about what we saw, and they said that the cave we spotted these things in needed to be investigated further. They sent more men over to the area that we had checked out. They apparently did not find anything. They even explored the surrounding area and the cave in question. The only other stories I've heard of from these creatures are when I had some friends who were in the Air Force during training. They talked about large hairy beasts in the woods. I always just thought it was a joke, until I had this experience. This story is one that my dad used to tell me, and is by far his scariest one. When my brother and I were kids, this was his go-to story whenever he returned home from his many out-of-state deployments. This was partly because he was too lazy for newer stories, and partly because it scared us to sleep nearly every time. Now that I'm much older, the story more intrigues me than it actually scares me. Although, I have never doubted its authenticity for a single second, and it has led me to believe and seek things that previously made me want to hide and wet my bed. Dad is now a retired military man, you see, and like most other military men, he is very old-fashioned, a very simple, sweet man. I have never known him to lie or fabricate stories to any extent for any reason. So, I know for sure that this is true. Besides, he has nothing to gain from making these up. Dad was a soldier in the Army. After USA invaded Afghanistan in 2001, he was among the first batch of soldiers to be deployed there. Even back then, the place was not all that much better than it is today. The country was torn to rags by terrorism, poverty, and corruption. It certainly was no picnic for its citizens who called it their home, or the soldiers who called it their workplace. Even without considering the bombings or terrorist attacks, every day in those times was drenched with murders, robberies, hunger, and general fear among the public. There were virtually no employment opportunities for the general public, and despite their fear of military men and women, which nearly rivaled their fear of terrorists themselves, sometimes people, including children, would often come to the troops to beg. Life then was all about survival. The entire experience was heartbreaking, but its commonness was what normalized it. The tragedy subjected to prolonged consistency is a tragedy with an effect bigger than its cause. That's what my father used to say. And now, after all these years, I understand his words. These soldiers had been instructed to be on the lookout for terrorists 24/7. They were told to gather intel, who had disguised and hidden among themselves as citizens. They attacked military men whenever they got the chance. The risk of being targeted was at an all-time high for all U.S. personnel. The instructions my father received were clear. Stick together, patrol often, and kill whenever you think you may need a kill. On such night of patrolling the Third World Gotham City with his fellow soldiers in their superior utility vehicle, they encountered something strange. They had been driving their usual way in a pretty abandoned piece of land when, in the distance, they saw two figures. My father and the soldiers readied their weapon, but as the vehicle edged closer, they realized that these figures were actually children. The car stopped near them, who had been staring in its direction ever since they had come into view. They were both girls, and could not have been more than over 7 years of age. Them being in the middle of nowhere was what highly alerted the soldiers, since they may have walked into an ambush. the lieutenant decided to simply report their location before stopping the vehicle. My father was the one who approached the children. He kept his firearm on his side and at the ready. He had no choice, but he put it to his side and walked towards them. As he edged closer, he felt strange and afraid. If you were a soldier stationed in Afghanistan during this time, being afraid and on edge would have been constant. But this was something different. Something instantaneous that grew bounds and leaps with every step. Despite the strange fear, he walked till he came face to face with the kids, asking them what they were doing in this dangerous place at this hour. The kids replied in perfect, literally perfect unison. They were lost, looking for their parents. At this point, my dad's legs had begun to tremble. It was like he had no control over them. They were acting on their own accord. The fear hadn't grasped him yet completely, but yet somehow, his legs refused to stay strong. Another soldier came over by his side just a few seconds later, and his dad had realized he had not said anything after his first question. As he opened his mouth to say something, his eyes flickered over their eyes. Their faces, illuminated in the dark by the scattering light from the headlamps, revealed their eyes to be black, like a shark's eyes, completely solid black. There was no visible separation of pupil or iris. They were simply two black balls, like an 8-ball. From the corner of the eye of the girl on the right, he could see the tiniest drop of blood seeking to travel down her cheek. Dad took a step back instantly, and due to his trembling legs, fell on his side. Seeing his sudden movement, the other soldier probably thought they were under attack by a sniper and had jumped to cover. "Look at their eyes," he tried to tell them. But no words had come out of his mouth. Trying to say that was the last thing he says he remembers before he had blacked out. It was not until the next evening that he had fully regained consciousness, waking up in a medical ward. Upon inquiry, Dad found out that he had simply fainted, and by the time other soldiers had carried him out to the vehicle, ensured there were no other assailants nearby who might have attacked him, these children magically vanished. The doctor, experienced as he was never able to pinpoint what had caused him to faint, and therefore had chalked it up to a case of acute dehydration. Neither my father nor any of the other troops ever came across those kids again, and my father claims that those kids were not human, that they had some sort of hold over him, enough to do things to his body. He was terrified. He said the moment he looked in their eyes, he felt this innate, deep primal fear come over him. He's never felt that, even in firefight. Other than their eyes, there had been nothing too unsettling about their appearance, enough to lure you in. But for some reason, meeting them had thoroughly shaken up my father. My name is John. I'm 31, currently enlisted in the military. I grew up in Pittsburgh, only recently moving back after my tour overseas ended. And now for my story. Roughly 6 months ago, late November, early December, me and 3 of my friends decided to take a 2-hour drive to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to find the elusive Mothman. Being that I grew up not far from there, it was a very nostalgic trip for me to take. But little did we know how much of an impact this trip alone would have on all of us. It began in my friend's van. We were about halfway there, and the van just shut off, no warning. No lights came on, nothing. Everything just shut off, and we coasted to a stop in the middle of the highway. Luckily, it was still daylight out. There wasn't much traffic, so we were able to get out safely and checking under the hood without being hit by a car or anything. After checking everything thoroughly, we noticed that the car's battery was completely drained. We had no idea what the problem could be. Everything else inside the engine seemed to be working just fine. After letting it rest for a bit, we kept trying everything we could think of, and randomly, the car started back up again, no problems. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Why were you so worried if the car started back up? after letting it rest. Well, we had a very bad feeling that the battery being drained and everything electronic with the car was potentially paranormal. The car had shut off only right when we were getting closer to Point Pleasant, which is where the Mothman sightings are said to be the most concentrated. I know this might sound crazy, but it's the only explanation that makes any sense to me. After that first scare, we decided to put on some music and got back on the road. The rest of the trip remained pretty uneventful, and we saw a deer running across the highway right in front of us out of nowhere. We had to slam on our brakes before this deer jumped high into the air, kind of almost gliding, and disappeared. It blew all of our minds. We had no idea how to explain that one. Later on, when we had finally arrived in Point Pleasant, and we had stopped at this small diner to grab some food, before heading up to an older TNT plant to try and look for the Mothman. As we were eating our dinner, something got my attention. I could see these bright lights out the corner of my eye. I was terrified when I realized the same lights that I saw earlier were this light that I was seeing now. I couldn't make sense of what it was, so I did my best to ignore it. After we left the diner and headed to the old TNT plant, we didn't find much either until we were leaving. Up, sort of off in the distance, in the dusk, we could see this huge flying figure. It looked just like something out of an X-Files episode. I swore I saw bright red eyes, staring blankly at us as we stood there in shock. I was not the only one seeing this. After taking a better look, I realized this was the Mothman, and it looked exactly like everybody thinks it does. Large bat-like wings and red eyes. It looked so much more real than any other sighting I've ever heard of. I'm still completely shaken from seeing it in person. After we all got over the initial shock of seeing this thing, we then decided to get a hotel, head back first thing in the morning. The shock of this was all far too much, and after we got back to Pittsburgh, we still had no idea what was going on. The next morning, as soon as we woke up, stepped outside, our car's battery had once again fully depleted. We were so confused as there was nothing else around us that would have caused a power surge like this to deplete our entire car's battery, let alone mess with the electronics. It was strange. We didn't know what to think. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm never going anywhere back around Point Pleasant. And even though I've served in the military, I still don't feel trained for situations like this one. The only reason we were able to get out of there alive was because Mothman was merciful enough to let us leave, or so I'm convinced. I understand this might sound crazy, but I'm not lying. I'm 25 years old, active-duty Navy pilot, stationed in North Carolina. The town I live in is a small southern town outside of Research Triangle Park. My story begins on a Saturday night, last fall, actually, 2013. It was around 11:30 p.m. I was walking out to my truck from work when I saw what appeared to be a large owl-like figure flying overhead. I spotted the owl on the electrical lines. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary to me at first, but it caught my attention because of how dark it was, and the way the night was. I couldn't help but think it appeared larger than normal. It also seemed like maybe it didn't look right. Its head did not exactly seem like an owl's, but more built like something large and flat, almost like, dare I say, a pterodactyl. Now, as this thing moved and spread out its wings, I kid you not, it looked far more dinosaur-like than anything I've ever seen. Really, making me rethink the whole owl thought. I watched it fly for about 3 seconds, and I'm convinced, if that was not a pterodactyl, then I don't know what it was. I eventually lost sight of it behind some pine trees, but not before thinking to myself, what did I just see? I stood there for a few seconds longer, wondering if I should go take a second look to see where it had gone, but ultimately decided against it. It's hard to explain, but as soon as I lost sight of the thing, my stomach felt uneasy, and I got the chills all over my body. I don't know why at first, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like something was wrong. I got into my truck and drove home. After about a 5-minute drive on the dirt road that is completely dark without a vent, I saw it again from the distance, and it was much larger than I initially thought. You could clearly see it. It looked weird, not like a giant owl like I had initially thought, and this just solidified my belief that it was indeed a pterodactyl. It looked very dinosaur-looking. Look, I'm not sure what lives out here, but I have a hard time thinking it was any sort of owl. Around here is thick swamps, so possibly it's been living there. But how's it gone on this long without ever being spotted? I don't know. If I'm lucky, I won't ever have to see it again. I remember an encounter we had when I was an officer serving in the Navy. The encounter had scared a lot of the officers, including me. We had gone on different expenditures, but none of them brought us the amount of fear and dread that this one did. I was serving on the USS Legend, a destroyer-class warship fitted with state-of-the-art weaponry. The ship was filled with genius officers from the US and other countries. Therefore, except for a few times when things went almost awry, we had it easy most times as our officers were the best Navy had to offer. A mission had taken us close to the Bermuda Triangle, which was also known commonly as the Devil's Triangle. Our mission had been completed successfully as usual, with the level of cohesion among our crew. We were chatting happily, congratulating each other for another successful mission. That's when it happened. The ship's sensors and radars were blaring. It kept telling us that something was wrong with the route we were passing through. Every officer was perplexed. We were unable to see anything. While we were in a state of worry and panic, it had appeared. A portal appeared in the distance. It was pulsating, moving to this strange rhythm that was reminiscent of a beating heart. I had a strange thought at that moment. What if this portal was the heart of a supernatural being? I shook my head to clear the crazy thought and focused what was in front of us. The captain, sensing danger, gave the order immediately to turn around. It was at that very moment the ship's power went down. The previously dormant portal suddenly became active. It exerted a strong force of attraction. The pulling force was so tremendous, it directly lifted our ship, sucked it into the portal despite our resistance. The journey through the portal felt like hell. Darkness surrounded us on all sides. Our ship turned, flipped and tumbled. Emergency lights were flashing, and alarms blaring. It took a lot of strength and stamina just to maintain a stable footing. When the ship finally stopped its descent, everyone was able to breathe a sigh of relief. Surprisingly, we found ourselves out on sea. It was obvious, though, there were no longer any familiar seas. Anxiety, distress, and fear of the unknown was written on everybody's face. We tried establishing communication, all to no avail. It was at that moment we knew we were somewhere else. There was no way to reach the outside world. Meanwhile, in the outside, there was great commotion going on in our HQ due to the disappearance of our ship. They had been monitoring our movement, and we suddenly had disappeared without a trace. It caused an uproar, and an active investigation was immediately launched. Other ships that were close to our location were ordered to move towards the last location we had been spotted at. They were ordered to search for any traces. Meanwhile, we were in dire straits on all other sides of the portal. Strange humanoid beings were popping out of the sea, all of them hostile, and attacking the ship in close proximity. This felt like a movie or an episode of X-Files. A grave look appeared on the captain's face, fighting back against these hordes of beings. We thought these things were already the worst, yet our nightmares were only just starting. This went on for days. We were all losing our minds. The trauma alone was too much to endure. Then, on the 5th day, something worse appeared, and our woes began. Officers began acting strange, almost hypnotized, turning on fellow officers, Numerous officers were beginning to kill each other, as if going insane. Many of our crew acting insane, throwing themselves off the ship, impaling themselves, and a greater part of our officers were killed. We kept on fighting to survive, trying to search for an exit, trying to search for a way back. Each thing we fought was stronger. We were running out of ammo. Between that and the diminishing rations and sanity, our ship was now becoming a battered state and in need of emergency repairs. We would not last much longer. The computers had estimated that the ship could last for another 4 days before engines would totally cease function. That news was like a rock pressing down on our hearts. On top of that, our GPS functionality was basically nil. We had no idea where we were, with no land in sight. If we did not find an exit within 4 days' time, death would be certain. At this point, our crew had dwindled significantly, from over 300 personnel, and current numbers barely added up to 70. We were overworked, as each of us had to cover for empty posts. Fatigue was beginning to show our faces, among insanity, shortness of food, and being attacked by these strange creatures coming up out of the sea. The ship and crew were now becoming a ghost of their former selves. If we did not find an exit, the USS Legend would become a legend of its own, and we would all go down with it. Yet, 3 days passed in the blink of an eye, and we were still unable to find an exit. The ship was beginning to lose functionality. It was obvious it was nearing its end, and would splutter out very soon. A chilling thought, most certainly. While some of us were willing to die with the ship, others were scared of the prospect of dying in a watery grave. We kept moving slowly, praying for a way out of this twisted world. Lady Luck seemed to be smiling on us, though. We were able to somehow find an exit, and just like the way we had came, we were sucked back in to the world in which we knew. With only 52 of us remaining, the entire ship, everything that happened to us, including the crew, were put under deep interrogation. Many of us forced to sign paperwork that would silence us eternally. Much of us were also given absence of leave, and any evidence of anything ever happening was quickly destroyed, so nothing would reach public ears. There have been a few others from this voyage that have tried to speak out to the public. Let's just say they were quickly silenced before anything could really get out to the public. Currently, I am reaching the end of my rope, dealing with stage 4 colon cancer. I don't have much time. I figured putting my thoughts on paper, writing this out and sending it to as many people I know as possible will ultimately be the best course of action. Take this as fictional if you will, but I'm here to expose the secrets and the conspiracies that the military and government have been hiding for oh so very long. I don't have anything to lose. I'm already dying and don't have much longer to live anyway as it is. If anything, I hope this opens up your mind to pierce through the lies and deceit they constantly spew. Best of luck and Godspeed. This is not an easy story to tell, as I try to explain to those who have been raised in a very strict Catholic family how, as a military officer, I've seen this. This event has happened just over 7 years ago now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it, thinking about the possibilities of the impossible. I've never thought anything of UFOs and the like, just considered it another way for people to get attention. That was always my opinion. This is not the first time out in the field that I've been a part of the Army. I've been part of the military since I was 19. This is not just something that occurred last week. So, here's what happened. It was a regular night. We were patrolling as per usual. Activity was pretty low, and we were pretty bored. Suddenly, we got the orders to keep patrolling, making our way down the highway until we met up with another unit and swapped patrol routes. This is not something I would like doing, as I always preferred working alone, but it's an order that must be followed. So, we began driving, and everything was fine until we passed a viewpoint. As I looked out towards the horizon, this thing popped up. This was not something that we could mistake. We both saw it, plain as day. and there was no way to explain it away with what we were seeing. There was a humanoid figure flying above us. Like any sane person, I swear that I must have been seeing things. We looked at each other to see if it was real. It definitely was not a bird. It looked like the faint shape of a human, floating high up in the sky. It almost appeared to have some sort of cape or some strange apparatus or a helmet. It was the most bizarre and terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was just sort of gliding there, in the sky, slowly drifting. None of us knew what to make of it. We got on the radio, telling the other unit about it. They had a look, and they agreed. We followed it as we slowly approached each other, and there was no mistaking. It was real. After a while of looking at it, it kind of just sort of vanished into thin air, like it was never there, almost as if it had dissipated, the way a cloud does. It didn't really make sense to me, but after thinking about it for a while, perhaps it was some kind of atmospheric disturbance. I don't know. I'm not sure if anyone's going to believe me, but all of us saw it. I can't say anything else as my superiors won't allow it. We're not even allowed or supposed to be speaking of this incident. I'm active military, and I've been stationed here in San Diego for about 3 months now. Since the very first day of my enlistment, I've heard some weird but interesting stories from shipmates and friends that also live out here. Obviously, stories are never proof of anything. They are just word of mouth. But they have made me realize that there was probably some truth to what they were saying. Now, about a year ago, my roommate and I went out for a smoke break around midnight. We were hanging out in our room, watching TV. We were both smoking cigarettes and decided to walk outside the barracks rather than go down to one of the designated smoking areas. We both walked over to one side of the building, away from the main road that many of our fellow shipmates also walked down to smoke at, one of the designated smoking areas. We looked out in the distance, trying to figure out where one of its lights was coming from, mainly because it seemed so low in the sky, and we had been talking about it for the whole walk, wondering what it could have been. After a few moments, we saw what appeared to be another light, further away but moving slowly. Our first thought was that it was an airplane or possibly a drone. After watching it for a few more moments, we realized this light wasn't moving like one would expect an aircraft to move. We finally decided to tell our other shipmate friends, who were currently sleeping in the barracks, about what we saw. Both of us knew they would not believe us. We woke both of them up, told them what we had thought we saw, and surprisingly, all three of us agreed that it was moving at a very strange rate for any aircraft. 2 hours, we watched this thing slowly move its way across the sky, getting lower and lower as time went on, until fully it disappeared away into the distance. We were using the outline of the hills in the distance to walk towards when we thought it had fully disappeared. As we got closer, there was no sign of anything, so we all agreed that it really must have just been some sort of strange weather phenomenon, or possibly unknown aircraft flying over us. I don't know if anybody else saw what we saw, but I would assume they did. I really have no way of knowing, though. The next morning, as we were going on our daily march to the chow hall, my roommate and friend mentioned something about a blue light, or some sort of strange phenomenon in the sky last night. We told him what we saw, and he just said, "Yeah, I saw it too." I'd heard they were testing some sort of secret craft. I know it sounds crazy, and he might have even been messing with us. But every single person we told this to believes us, although we never mentioned anything about the craft that led in the distance. From that day on, I didn't really think about it anymore. However, I did try and do some research, and after reading stories that always seem to end with something bad happening, like people getting abducted or disappearances, I hope nothing weird happens. I kind of wish that something did happen, though. If it is the military conducting some sort of test flights, then I hope they don't do it without letting us know what's going on. I really don't know if this is one of the weird things people hear about out here, But I don't feel that this was normal, and it was appropriate for me to share my experience with everybody, just in case it might be worth looking into. I had always wanted to join the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps. I love nursing. I got into the program, but first, they told me that I needed to do hospital rotation and train at Naval Hospital Pensacola first to get experience before they could take me on the Navy officially. Now, before I go on, you might have heard that the land on which Naval Hospital Pensacola was built had been previously used as a field hospital during World War II. It was years after that building was constructed. I had been doing fully day shifts, barely managing to get several hours of sleep, 3 or 4 if I was lucky. It was physically demanding and incredibly exhausting. But I did enjoy the rush and the exhaustion at the end of the day. Because of COVID, the hospital began opening to more people and shifts increased, even with more limited nursing staff, an insane number of people coming into the hospital for treatment for everything. I was in the pediatric section, taking a look at a young baby, at most 25 months, brought in with severe pneumonia and a compromised immune system. I had heard the baby crying and sucking for air. It made my heart break. I paged a doctor as I took off the stethoscope from my neck and started feeling for the baby's lungs. They were filling up with fluid and fast. I knew that thoracentesis would relieve the baby's pain temporarily until a doctor could properly assess him. Thoracentesis is a procedure utilizing a needle, making a hole to remove fluid, making breathing easier. I got a sterilized needle and just stared at the baby as his cries became more struggled and stifled. I had never done it before. I did not want to end up making it worse, so I was hesitating. Just then, I saw a senior nurse rushing towards me. She looked weird, like faint and a light glow around her. I thought it was just my glasses. She immediately took the needle from my hands and performed the procedure, getting the fluid out of the baby. I even saw the tag on her uniform. It said, Nurse May. I stared at her as she all did it so calmly. I thought it was strange. I did not recognize her. I'd never seen her before. And her hair and outfit seemed quite different as well. Out of date. I thanked her and told her I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I would most definitely have messed it up had she not come to the rescue. She looked at me and gave me a small smile. Told me that she was happy to help, and it just takes some practice. Then she began walking out of the pediatric section. Just as she opened up the door, the doctors and a few other nurses rushed inside completely. They were out of breath, and the weirdest thing that happened was they passed right through her. Like literally. She was just there, but they didn't see her. I kept staring at Nurse May as she walked off in the distance, disappearing. One of the doctors shook me and made me come back to the moment. They noticed the procedure was done, and done properly. They immediately appreciated it, but I told them I didn't do it. They asked who did. When I told them it was Nurse May, they all looked at me and looked at each other. There were no known medical personnel there at that location by the name of Nurse May. They looked baffled and confused. Anyway, the entire conversation ended there. After a few days, I got a little free time. I went into the records department and began looking up the nurses list. I found one, but it was from 1959. Under the name of May Howell, she had died in January of 1961. Am I hallucinating, losing my sanity, or going crazy? Or had the actual spirit of an old nurse passed, come help me save a baby's life? Currently in the Army here. Currently, I'm 24 years old. I was also raised pretty religiously. My father is a pastor. Now, on to my story. I'm very much into hiking, camping and kayaking. Well, anything to do with nature, really. My friend Alex and I love to go out exploring and find new places. See how far we can hike within a day's time. We recently mapped out one of our favorite hikes that takes us through parts of 3 different states: Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Today, we attempted to make the hike, since the weather was supposed to be nice. However, there was also considerable smoke from some of the fires. Visibility was a little bit more on the poor side. I guess that's what you get for trying to hike in August. Since we started at our usual spot, we had just finished our first mile, and we still had many more to go. This was going to be a several-mile-long trek that would take us 2 weeks. We were walking along, and for some reason, I was really drawn to this certain spot. I can't really explain it. The view, though, was stunning. Alex, my friend, stopped me by this point to take in the scenery, and all of a sudden, he noticed something moving in between 2 bushes, roughly 50 feet away. Usually, there are many deer around here, so we weren't too concerned. But what we saw most certainly was no deer. It was something most bizarre. The first thing I noticed was that it was a pale white and kind of hobbled around on 2 legs, but was more kind of crawling on all 4s. It looked very strange. I could not see any eyes or facial features right off the bat, but that it moved very odd, almost slithering, except on all 4s, if that's any form of an accurate way to describe its movements. I found myself mesmerized, just by how strange it looked, while also feeling scared. It was one of those things where I was in awe, but also disgusted. It seemed to have taken notice to us standing there. After a few seconds, it looked right at us, and had a very curious expression on its face. The next thing I knew, it sprinted away faster than anything I've ever seen in my life, easily around 30 miles an hour. It was gone in a matter of seconds. I don't know what we saw that day, but whatever it was, I'll never forget about it. As somebody who's not well versed in the paranormal at all, I'm pretty blown away by what we saw. It doesn't make any sense, and it's driving me crazy that I cannot find out what it was. We know what we saw, and we know it was something not in this world. I'm active duty National Guard, 29, in great health. I'm very physically active when I can. I feel like keeping up my endurance and my health is very, very important. Just as important as eating right and keeping this machine going. This past weekend, I was down at the beach for a friend's bachelor party. It was around 1 in the morning. We decided to take a quiet walk along the shoreline, right near our campsite. We were walking along, enjoying the quiet night air, and suddenly, out of nowhere, something began moving towards us fast. It stopped at about 30 feet away, immediately began making these bizarre yells and screeches and roars. It sounded almost like insect clicking its tongues against its abdomen, or some other sort of strange noise that I could hardly describe. It was a very high-pitched sound. It resembled the kind of noise you would expect some kind of large bug, rather than a human or animal, like some sort of large insect. We were all pretty startled. We stood there staring, and that's when we heard another ear-splitting screech, before we could hear something big moving through the tree line, heading back in the opposite way it came. That's all I have to really share for now, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. They're going to be traveling with me on vacation next week, so if more information develops, I'll post it. As far as why nobody else in my campus saw this thing, it was around 1 in the morning, after everybody had gone to bed. I spoke to one of my friends who is also in the military. He believes I either encountered a Sasquatch, or possibly a mantis humanoid. I've tried Googling the strange noise, and I could not find anything useful, or any mention of a creature like this worldwide. I will continue my search, and hopefully, somebody knows something about it. I was just a trooper, with patrolling duties at the Oklahoma City Bombing Memorial for a while. This was before I was assigned to a different task and location. This occurred on one of the days I was working there. It was at nighttime, a little after 2 in the morning, and I began to feel a chilly breeze that made me shudder. It was weird, considering it was 89 degrees Fahrenheit and a fairly humid night. I didn't pay much attention to it. It was the unified humming that truly caught my attention and made me feel like something was wrong. The humming was just at the right frequency to make you feel uneven and nervous. It began to get louder and seemed to be coming from a certain spot around the building. I was standing at the front at the moment. The backside has the memorial ground. It sounded like many men humming together. When I paid attention to it, it clicked in my head that it appeared to be some song, or so that's how I perceived it. Like this mechanical humming actually had melody and rhythm to it, but only faintly. It was enough to make it incredibly eerie. I froze on the spot, watching and trying to make out where the sound was coming from. Although I could not pinpoint a direction, I just kept staring at the building, hoping somebody else would give me some sort of inkling as to what was going on, and that I was not the only one going crazy here. After a while, the humming stopped entirely. There was no sound, no singing, no growling, nothing. While it could be easy to hear this and write this entire thing off as possibly construction work, or maybe there was work being done underground. But that's not what it sounded like. It was very loud, like there was a construction site right nearby. But at this time, there was no construction going on anywhere around where I was located. And if there was, at the sheer volume that we had heard it, it would have been very visible and very noticeable. It did not sound like it was far from the distance. It sounded like it was right by. And the humming was almost kind of a grinding noise, like two pieces of metal grinding really hard together, making this sort of weird, dissonant melody. In all my years of life, I have never experienced something like that before, and I never have since then. This was a very spooky occasion. I lived in Kentucky all my life. I work for the U.S. military as a base security officer. I'm young and relatively new to this job, so it's quite possible that I missed something obvious while training. But saying things like this, like what I'm about to tell you about, can really make it difficult to sleep. I got off work at about 10:30 p.m. yesterday night, was heading home, and I noticed a strange light formation in the sky. The stars were bright and clear, not a cloud in the sky, but these 4 bright lights just appeared out of nowhere. They were this golden yellow color, like an orb almost identical to the way some machinery can light up. I pulled my car over to get a better look at it. It seemed to be headed right in my direction. The light formation continued to grow in size, and then almost formed into this massive bat-like creature emerging from the light. This thing was easily 10 feet long, if not larger, and left this light trail behind it, probably about 250 feet, if not more. These are just rough estimates. I tried to look for any reference points, but it was near impossible. The wings were very bat-like, and it flew with this grace that I've never seen with any creature before. This thing kind of circled around the area before disappearing into the night sky. The creature had resembled that of a human skull, but was covered in fur. The body was more like a giant bat, and had 4 arms, and also very large leathery wings. The eyes were small and sunken into the skull. It looked very menacing. This beast that glowed this bright, ominous light. The whole thing was just so bizarre and alien. I've been utterly terrified since it happened, and have been unable to sleep because of the imagery in my head. I have no idea what it is. I would very much so like to know more about this thing so I can piece together what it looked like. I know this might sound crazy, but I swear on my life that this happened. I'm not sure if this was some sort of top-secret military project, but I could tell you that me and a few others have never seen anything like it. Only me and a few others even saw it. I can imagine why they would want to keep this a secret. Maybe perhaps we really did see an alien, or some sort of alien-like creature. Granted, I've read many UFO encounters and stories before, but I've never heard of anything or anybody seeing some sort of craft or ball of light transform into an actual creature. But besides me trying to make sense of the logistics of the situation, it really terrified I served for 9 years in various different jobs throughout the world as a member of a combat engineer unit. I've seen many disturbing stuff during my time, and it's not too hard to believe me when I say what I saw. I've been out since 2010, and am now currently working as a federal contractor. This happened back in 2009 during a routine training mission. We were out in the middle of nowhere, basically just running some basic patrol drills. This also took place in Mississippi. Our team had to split off from the rest to try and flank around a hillside when we saw it standing there, staring at us. It was probably about 7 feet tall, covered in dark gray hair and dark red eyes that almost seemed to glow in the night of the light. It had the head of a wolf, teeth that were far too sharp and long to be any regular animal. It also had these huge pointed ears, and it never took its eyes off us, not even once. I remember shouting for my team to scatter, and before running in every which direction. When we noticed each other, it lunged at us. I know for a fact we took it down. One of my guys fired about 6 shots from his M4 carbine, and it fell, but quickly pulled itself back up. It came at him again, firing about another 6 rounds into this thing's chest and 2 into its skull, killing it. He would tell me later on that each bullet felt like it had very little effect. Although this was a very traumatic experience for me and my entire team, we all met up at the rendezvous point, and we didn't mention this to anybody else. I don't know what this creature was, but it felt extremely dangerous. I would say that this creature was in fact a Dogman. As I'd mentioned before, I'm not too familiar with the paranormal, so it's hard for me to say exactly what it was. But knowing what I do now, I believe this was indeed a Dogman. It has all the characteristics written all over it, and after everything we've seen and done during our time in service, we can't imagine that this would possibly be anything else. I wanted to give you a little bit of background information on myself. I'm 67, and I served as a sniper in Vietnam. I have pretty much spent my entire life in the Midwest. I've since retired from the military. I have a degree in engineering, and have spent my life dedicated to the military. I've done well enough for myself to have never needed to work again since retiring from military. My father was an alcoholic, abusive, who had only married my mother because she got pregnant with me. He too was in the military, and when he got out, he moved back home to the Midwest. I was raised by my mother until I turned 18. She's still alive at 95, living in a nursing home in the next state over, where she's close enough to visit about once a month. I'm telling you this because my upbringing made me hard. It allowed me to endure hardship that I would face through my time in the military, as well as Vietnam. Now, let's get on to the actual story and how the idea of a Dogman was laughable. But now, after my experience, I'm not so sure. My wife is very convinced I had a sighting. I was walking my dog near our house at night, and I began hearing strange noises nearby. This happens often. We do live out in the countryside. But as I got closer to inspect where the noise was coming from, it stopped and then started again, about 100 yards away now, being much, much louder. I'm thinking something's going on. As soon as I get closer again for a good look, this thing steps out from behind the trees and takes off running down the hill on all fours away from me. It was the largest black wolf I have ever seen in my life. I'm not really sure what else it could be, other than maybe a weird dog or something like that. It doesn't seem very likely, but it is possible. It was far too big to be a normal-sized wolf. I can assure you with certainty that I'm not crazy or delusional. This creature was easily the size of a wolf, but had to be something else. I have never seen such a large black wolf in my life, and there's no way it was just a stray dog. This thing was easily the size of a moose, and I kid you not. I wanted to share a story in hopes that it would possibly help others believe. My wife is very concerned that these things are not fake. After all, her entire family has had encounters with Dogman. Hence, we're out here in the Midwest, in Michigan, all around Wisconsin. She thinks they're very real. It doesn't make any sense to her, but I guess after all this, I'm coming out of denial. This has been our experience. It's probably not very interesting, but thank you for letting me share anyway. My dad and I were coming back from a family reunion in Tennessee, and we decided to go to some places that had made him the happiest as a child. Seeing as how our family had moved from that area before, he was far old enough to really remember them. We arrived at one specific location, and we noticed a famous stream that he would always talk about as a kid that he loved to go and fish at, play, and just be a kid had been replaced by a small highway. So we drove around a little while longer, searching for other areas. We found another good one, a little place that he liked to hang out as a teenager. This area was now full of discarded cans and garbage. It wasn't all that great. As we're kind of looking around this area, further back, there were trails that he would usually hike down, and being a teenager, was full of debauchery. He's motioning for me to continue down this trail that led just a little bit deeper into the woods. Now, keep in mind, at this point, a lot of the surrounding wilderness had been turned to highway, and much of the surrounding swamps were now being used for development, not like they were back in the 80s. Now, the surrounding woods we were entering were very thick, very dense. It even kind of cut off light the further in you went. And, I don't know exactly what it was at first. I guess I kind of just got a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Not anything specific, like what you tell in your stories where people get the feeling that they were being watched. Nothing like that. It was more just a gut instinct, like it's probably not safe to continue on further. In that moment, I assumed it was maybe because there might be dangerous homeless people around, or drug addicts, or what have you, since there did seem to be signs of homeless camps, what with all the garbage and cans and stuff, or worse. Now, out of the blue, my father stops dead in his tracks, sticks out his arm as if to stop me from walking further, and I look up at him, and he's staring right at something, and he has the most serious expression on his face. So I'm asking him, "Dad, what do you see? What's up?" And I look out to where he's looking. Well, directly in front of us was kind of this little marsh, I guess you can call it. There was a cement wall on the other side that led to a lone road. Well, on this concrete block, or concrete wall, I guess you can call it, was a medium-sized storm drain. And out of the storm drain was climbing this, what I'll describe to you as a Lizardman. I feel silly for even typing that, but that's the only way how I know how to describe it. I mean, imagine a person in a lizard costume or something. Except the movements were so smooth that there's no way this would be somebody in a costume. All the way out here, it didn't really make any sense. We weren't exactly miles and miles out from town, but we also weren't in the middle of a metropolitan area either. And who in their right mind would be climbing out of a storm drain in that sort of costume? We saw it kind of climb its way out and climb down into the marsh. Luckily, we were kind of tucked away back in the trees enough where this creature or animal did not seem to notice us. But my father and I got a very good look at it. Honestly, it kind of reminded me of like a half-man, half-dinosaur sort of thing. The head was very much so reptilian-like. The body was covered in scales, and it had a man very much like a body. 2 arms, a chest, body, legs, all that stuff. Which is why I made the Lizardman costume reference a paragraph ago. Once it climbed down out of the storm drain, it began walking off in the opposite direction, into the thick tree line where there's more dense, thicker swamps. It never turned to look in our direction, and never seemed to have noticed us. My dad, of course, his gaze was locked on this thing for the whole 20-30 seconds that we watched it disappear. I think him and I were in such shock and awe, but more so him. I kind of couldn't believe my eyes, but he seemed to have this look on his face, that just screamed danger. After this thing disappeared into the thicket of the trees, he finally broke his gaze and looked at me and just said, "We should leave. Now." I wasn't going to challenge that. I didn't ask any questions, so we quickly headed on back up the trail, maybe no more than a half a mile, up to the original spot that had all those discarded cans and garbage, made our way back further, and got to the car. After some time, I was the one to finally break the silence and ask, "Dad, what did we see out there? I mean, we both saw it, right? Is that some sort of unidentified animal or maybe undiscovered species?" He remained quiet and just looked at me with a very cold stare and said, "I don't know, son, but I didn't like it." I mean, I know it's a very anticlimactic ending to my encounter, but that's really all that was said. And my father and I have not talked about it since. I mean, I don't really see much of a reason to, but I thought in recent events with the world, I would maybe try and find some time, now that I had off, to reach out to different paranormal investigators and even story narrators, which is why I'm kind of drawn to your work and your channel. So I thought I would shoot you an email. And hey, worst comes to worst, I don't get a response. And best comes to best, you read my story and your audience can help me out, since it appears they've helped out so many others. Best of luck and thank you so much. It was at nighttime, and I was driving along Highway 24, right around the area of this old mill house. This is when I stopped at a stop sign, and I see something large coming out of the tall field grass. At first, I assumed it was maybe a deer, but then I saw it was clearly no deer. The creature I saw, well, I can't identify it. I can tell you this though. It was a behemoth of a thing. Maybe 800 pounds, and I'm not exaggerating. And its body was large and very serpentine-like, or snake-like, I should say. The head alone was maybe 2 or 3 feet large. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. This thing was massive. And it just seemed to kind of rise up out of the grass so calmly. It got about 10 feet away from my car and just glanced on by, as if me being there wasn't a big deal at all. In fact, it really didn't pay any attention to me. Like, it could have cared less that I even saw this thing. And as you can imagine, seeing something like this for the first time, especially at night, feeling extremely vulnerable, having no weapons, nothing, I was terrified out of my mind. This giant human reptile thing walking around with 2 red eyes. Part of me wanted to just stick in my disbelief. This creature checked off every box in a horror movie cliche. But at the same time, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Its gait, its movement. You could see its muscles and skin. I mean, either this was somebody in the most convincing Hollywood monster costume I have ever seen and that's ever been made, or this was something truly out of this world. What's your opinion? This story takes place back in 2014. I was in a 2-story house with my brother, kind of out in the backwoods of Missouri. He and his band rented this house out collectively for rehearsal. It wasn't an out of town too far, but you had to drive maybe about 10-15 minutes to get to it. And being a good brother that he is, allowed me to stay in the upper 2 stories part, which is just one big open room, which I used for my bedroom for a couple of weeks after getting out of a very toxic relationship. So, very early on in the morning, I'd say 3 or 4, I was having trouble sleeping, and I'm out there on the balcony looking down just at the woods and the surrounding area, lost in thought. And I suddenly see a huge, maybe 6-7 foot tall dark figure darting across the tree line. It caught my attention, and I thought it was an animal at first, until I looked. That's when I could see the figure much more clearly, because it moved. What I was looking at was a large bipedal animal, and believe it or not, It kind of resembled a cross between a gorilla, a lizard, and a human. Although I couldn't see every enunciation of detail. It was very dark in color. Not just its coloring, but the lighting as well. Its head was huge. It had big long arms, and its body was also large too. The head, though, was more elongated, and, like I stated, easily 6 to 7 feet tall. The only reason that I even saw this thing was because it was a full moon that night. But where the moon was positioned and angled in the sky did not, unfortunately, light up this thing so I can get a look at it. It was in fact on the other area of the sky, giving just enough light that I could see something was here, but not all the details that I wanted. I know it might sound kind of morbid, but I was kind of wanting to see what this thing looked like. Only because it was so unique, I guess. It stood there in the tree line for maybe, 10-15 seconds, and then kind of disappeared deeper into the woods. I was the only person at the house at the time, and I actually wasn't that creeped out. While it was slightly disturbing, I kind of just wrote it off as maybe the darkness playing tricks in my eyes. Maybe the stress and emotional baggage from the bad relationship was causing me to see things that weren't exactly there. I slept on it, and after getting up the next morning, I realized last night was indeed not just stress, but I actually saw something. I've always been a believer in monsters and animals we might not be able to explain, and I've even seen some strange things in my life. But this, my friend, was definitely the strangest I had hands down ever seen. I was on this big adventurous hike to a lake with my friends. We had to walk through at least a couple of miles of woods from where we parked to get to said lake. And for the sake of the story, I'm going to keep the name of the lake anonymous, but I can tell you that it was a very popular lake. Still is. And since I was leading me and my few friends, I was of course in front. And as we're walking through the woods to get to said lake, I noticed something weird. I saw this big shadow, and I looked at it, trying to figure out what it was. I noticed it was kind of watching us from in between some trees, and it stayed perfectly still, so that's why I didn't exactly catch it at first. My first inkling was that it was maybe a man, but the more I looked at it, even with how dark it was, it looked wrong. Now, before I go on, you might be thinking, oh, well, you just saw Bigfoot. But I'm telling you, Bigfoots don't look like this thing did. This had a much more reptile-like appearance. The head was very long. The arms were very long. It kind of reminded me of a serpent head on a human body, with scales and everything, but just dark. After looking at it, I stopped my friends and had them look too, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. As soon as we all stopped and began gawking at this thing, it immediately tilts its head up to look at us and starts jolting after us. We all start screaming and began running back the way we came. We could hear it chasing after us in the woods, and it caught up very quickly. I mean, it was probably no more than 30 yards away at max, and it was in a section of woods where it wasn't so thick we couldn't see it. It's like it was waiting there for somebody, for us. The thing chased after us though, and it was moving so fast, I didn't think it was possible. We didn't know what to do, so we ran and we ran, and we were able to ran back to where we had initially parked. I was so scared. I mean, all of us were. We were all looking at each other like, did that just happen? What was that? I'm not sure why, but I believe whatever this thing was could have caught up to us and grabbed us. But it didn't. It's like it wanted to chase us out for whatever reason. We were only maybe a half mile in the trail, and we all said that we could all hear it almost right behind us, right in the trees. I'm not sure why it never reached out and tried to grab any of us. That's kind of a mystery to me. So we all get in the car and we drive off. And we're trying to speculate what it was. What animal could it have been? A few of us talked and argued that it was a Bigfoot. But Bigfoots don't look like that. Not that I'm aware of, at least. Unless I'm missing something. Yes, we were all terrified, but I strongly feel that this was something else entirely. I don't know if lizardmen exist or snake men exist, but that's the closest thing I could even compare it to. It was my son and I, and a friend. We were out trout fishing at a local lake, not too far away from home base. It was a late summer evening, around maybe 9:30, just enough to where it was getting pretty dusky, but not quite dark yet. We were all sitting at the end of a dock fishing, and we had our dog, Jody, with us. He's a sweet boy, a Labrador retriever. We take him on all of our outings. At least we like to think he keeps us safe. He barks whenever there's a predator around, so he does a pretty good job of warning us and warding off any potential danger. And thanks to him, with this encounter, we saw what we did and potentially saved our lives. We're sitting there with our lines in the water, lost in conversation, and we hear Jody start barking and barking at something. I turn my attention, and I see he's barking at the water off to our left. Then I look a little closer, and I see the shape of something large coming up out of the lake. I motion to my friend and my son, and they all look in unison, and we're watching as Jody now begins to bark frantically, going crazy. And then, out of the lake, steps this horror. I don't even know how to describe it accurately in detail. It kind of reminded me of a half-man, half-alligator. Really ugly and grotesque looking, covered in scales and that thick armor plate that alligators are known for having. It just kind of ascends up out of the water. This elongated face. It turns and looks at us, stares at Jody, and casually walks off into the thicket that's right there, maybe no more than 10 feet from the water. As soon as it fully ascends out of the water and onto the shore, Jody begins whimpering and running back towards us, as he's terrified of whatever creature that is. My son, nearly soiling himself, was screaming, "Dad, Dad, what is that? What did we just see?" And my friend, of course, was silent, as was I. We couldn't really say much, but we all three agreed in unison. Let's leave. I just didn't feel it was safe there anymore. On the drive back, we all kind of talked about it a little more and said, "Man, I don't know what that thing was, but as soon as we saw it, this feeling of we should leave now, it's not safe, just kind of took over all of us. I mean, had it not, I don't think we would have left. Something was wrong. What that something was, I don't know. Look, I'm not an advocate for the strange and paranormal. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that, or even Bigfoot or strange creatures. But I can't explain this animal. I don't want to go so far as to say it was a lake monster. I feel like that's ridiculous, but I've never seen a reptilian that was bipedal, that also came out of the lake. That was a first for all of us." Let me just say this first and foremost. I'm not a conspiracy person. I don't own a tinfoil hat, metaphorically of course, and I'm a pretty rational, scientific-rooted person. But I have no way to explain away this experience that I had back in 1998. Let me tell you, I was just a sophomore in college, and I was working in a bar in a small town in southwestern Florida. It was a great place, frequented by locals, many of whom I knew and many of whom knew me. We had a lot of regular faces. It was a place where people could get beer and never have to worry about somebody making them feel uncomfortable or getting hit on or getting in a fight. At least, not while on my shifts. It was a fun place. At the time, I was the only girl working there. I was the bartender and the only female that served beer. So, I was the only female that had to work at the bar. The place was a small old building that had originally been a gas station, and years later was converted to the store, and then eventually became a bar. The bar was in the front, and the back of the building held the kitchen, a small office, and the bathrooms. So, enough about that. It was a Saturday night. I was working the bar all by myself, which I was accustomed to. I had worked by myself quite a bit, and I'm not gonna lie, I have never made as great as tips as I ever have in my life working that job. But tonight was pretty slow. The place only had a few customers, and I was chatting with a group of maybe 3 people who were sitting there at the bar. Just small talk, just joking around and having fun. I thought I was having a pretty good time until this particular man walked in. He walks up right to the bar and I turn around, cleaning a bar mug. I did not know this man. I'd never seen him before, but there was something interesting about what he wore and the way he looked. I did not know anybody else who knew him. In fact, I wasn't the only one startled by his presence. Everybody in that bar seemed to kind of have that Hollywood movie moment where the guy walks in and where everybody just stops and kind of stares with a blank expression. That's the perfect way to kind of captivate this moment. He sits down, never breaking a stare. I mean, he's a big guy, strong jawline, dark hair. He had a black shirt on and jeans and looked like he had just come from the gym. The thing that struck me the most, though, was his eyes. They were these incredibly dark eyes. Not like fully black or anything, but he just had really stark, contrasty eyes. They were almost hypnotizing, and not in a lustful, romantic way. It was almost like a trance, like he had this power. I know, it's a bizarre description, but that's what it was. He had this very intense look on his face, almost like he was waiting for somebody, me, to say something. So I kind of stood there without a word, just staring back at him, wondering who this guy was. After a little bit, maybe 10 seconds, I nervously just said, "Can I help you?" without him ever breaking his gaze. He just kept stare, smirked a little, and just said, "I think so." Now at this point, I was getting creeped out. His demeanor, his attitude, everything was just weird. I mean, I've worked here already for a while, and no guy has ever just came in here and looked at me like that, without saying anything. I didn't know what he wanted, and I did not know who he was. So, my response was, okay, what do you want?" He paused for a moment. Keep in mind, during this entire interaction, I don't even think I saw the man blink once, let alone break eye contact. It was the creepiest thing. He calmly just says, "I want you," in a very monotone. At this point, not only am I creeped out, but I'm confused. And in the moment and being nervous, I was like, I'm working, what do you want?" He smirked again and said, "I would like to buy you a drink, if you want one." I had to politely kind of shoot him down and say, "Well, I'm working, so I don't drink right now. But maybe if you stick around, you can buy me one later." So he said, "Okay." And he just sat there, looking at the menu. And so now I'm kicking myself for even saying that. Stupid. Why did I give him such an invitation? Oh gosh, I was a nervous wreck. The people sitting at the bar just kept staring back at me, staring back at him, staring at each other, exchanging glances of confusement and, "Oh boy, she's in trouble" kind of look. He sat there quiet, and I was busy cleaning and doing my job duties. Maybe 45 minutes goes by and he's still sitting there, staring at the menu. I think I asked him, "Have you thought about what you wanted yet?" And as he turns to look back up at me, here's the terrifying part. As he lifts his head up in response to my question, his eyes were not normal. There was something wrong with them. They looked like snake eyes or something. They were this dark green and had these huge black slits in them. And maybe like a half second later, no more than a second, it's almost like they turned normal again. Like the same way an alligator does. You know, how they have those secondary eyelids. It was like a blinking, but not with his actual eyelids. I kind of screamed when I saw it, and kind of flung myself back. He did that blinking thing and his eyes were normal again, just very dark. And he looked puzzled, but still very mono-expressive. Tilted his head very robotically and asked, "What's wrong?" I told him, "You need to get out of here now, or I'm calling the police." Then, without ever breaking eye contact, he slowly stands up, then turns his head and his body, and slowly goes to walk out the door. As he gets to the door, he stops as his hand touches the door, turns around, looks at me again, and says, "It's a shame. You would have made such a great addition." Then immediately turned around and walked out. That was the last I ever saw of him. My skin felt like it was crawling. I was so creeped out. The guys at the bar were like, "Who was that guy?" And I told them, "I don't know." Luckily, my regulars were very kind and nice to me and said, "Hey, we don't know who he was, but we all got the creeps. We'll stay here late if you'd like to use clothes to protect you." I thought that was very kind, and I took all three guys up on the offer. And they stayed with me until my shift ended at around 1 or 2 in the morning, kept me company. The guy never reappeared. So that's my college story. Now, here's an important note. Fast forward almost 10 years to about 2009, and my aunt is very big, still is by the way, into the paranormal and things like conspiracy theories, reptilians, all that kind of stuff. Nothing that I really ever pay attention to. But I guess she was telling me there are these beings called reptilians. They apparently have the ability to shapeshift into people. I kind of laughed the notion off at first, and then she went on to show me some clips. People being caught on camera, like newscasters and TV hosts and celebrities, except their eyes change, and she showed me that. I felt my skin crawl again. That memory of that night instantly came back to me. That's exactly what I saw that night. I didn't tell my aunt anything. I mean, I always thought she was kind of crazy, but I just kind of shot her down and was like, "Yeah, that's terrifying." But I knew deep down, something was wrong with that man. I can't sit here and say with concrete evidence that was exactly the case, but the resemblance to the video she showed me, to what his eyes looked like and his strange odd behavior, sure is uncanny how close they're related. Hi, what lurks beneath? Before I tell you this, I trust you'll keep my name anonymous, and my location anonymous as well. And I also trust that you'll at least hear me out, and if I'm lucky, read my story. I know you're a busy man, and so I bet with all the stories you get, you probably don't have much time. Well, here's mine, and feel free to use it if you'd like. I lived in the swampy areas of Illinois for a very long time. I was deer hunting in the swamps, about 3 years ago now. This day in particular was very foggy, and I was busy walking along a path in the swamp. I heard a noise that was not something I'm used to hearing. It was like this very fast pitter-pattering, except the pitter-pattering was not that of light weight. These were heavy, more like thuds against the ground. I knew it was something because, again, I never heard anything like this before. Thinking maybe it was an alligator, I got down, crouching and listening for a moment. It was actually coming up in the trees around me, not on the ground. I'm thinking to myself, what the? And then I hear branches kind of breaking and moving up in the trees around me. So I get up from a crouched position, and I'm looking around. Instantly, as I turn behind me, I see these glowing pairs of eyes looking at me. This was during the day, mind you, so my visibility wasn't exactly poor. What I was looking at, I have no explanation for. It was just this big creature. It looked very dinosaur-like, if I can describe it. I had a hard time seeing the entirety of the thing,
even though the light was good, because of how it was holding onto the tree. It was kind of crouched, on a large branch, actually, higher up in the trees. It had a pretty big head, and looked to be bigger and taller than I was. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my truck, and I've never really sat down to tell anybody this before. But I know what I saw, and it was not a deer. What this thing was, I don't know. To me, it reminded me of some failed genetic experiment somebody tried to do by splicing human and dinosaur DNA. Sure, it sounds like a science fiction plot gone wrong, but that's what I saw. This was back in 2016. I was with my friend Josh on a run in the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey. It was a cool autumn morning. The sun was out, and the leaves were just starting to change color. And it was the perfect morning for a run. We were running a trail, just for exercise and to get some good fresh air. A nice brisk pace always helps the body. And this particular trail was slightly challenging, with it being uphill. We were both talking about how nice it was out and how much we enjoyed being out here in the woods. So, here's a quick note, before I go any further with my story. Yes, I'm aware that Pine Barrens is home to all sorts of strange stories and encounters. Things like UFO sightings and bright lights, alien abductions, Bigfoots, and yes, even the Jersey Devil. I've heard it all, but I've never experienced anything myself. Never seen anything, never felt anything weird, and I've lived here for a long time. Not all my life, but enough time in the Pine Barrens, hiking and running around, that I feel like if those things were true, I would have seen something, at least by now. Well, that mentality that I had was proven wrong this day. As I was saying, we were running on this trail when, up ahead of us, we see something. Now bear in mind here, this is what we saw. We saw something big climbing out of the ground. At first, we kind of stopped thinking, what is this? But it happened very fast. This large lizard-like thing pulled itself out of the ground within a matter of seconds, like it just kind of dug itself out. Think of how in the movies where it shows, zombies digging themselves out of a grave and pulling themselves up. It was similar to that, but it was way faster. It was like a slick, solid motion of just arms out, body coming up out of the ground, boom. I feel like the phrase pooping bricks is a severe understatement to how Josh and I felt. We were frozen, as this being had pulled itself out of the ground, and its expression was kind of stunned and shocked that we were there, like it wasn't sure how to react to the fact that we had seen it. And we were kind of just locked in this stare for, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds, before Josh just grabs me and takes off going the opposite direction. My body reacted and we both ran as fast as we could. Somehow, we managed not to scream, and I'm really surprised I didn't scream like a little girl after seeing what we did. We get all the way back down the trail and get back to the parking lot, where we stop and try to catch our breath. After heaving and breathing heavily, maybe a minute goes by and we're finally able to breathe enough to where we can ask each other, "What was that? Did you see that? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh." And yeah, I can't believe we saw that. What was that? None of us knew. None of us could even think about what it could have been. Like I told you already, I have lived here for at least 10 plus years and have never even heard or seen of anything remotely like that. Let me give you a good description of what it was, since we had such a good view of it. This thing was a dark green, almost black, and it was covered in scales. It had a body similar to a man, but very large clawed hands and feet, and the head was almost kind of like a velociraptor, at least in shape. The eyes were a very contrasty yellow, very piercing, actually. We never saw any teeth, but I guess the best description, I would call it, is a dinosaur man, because it was like half man, half dinosaur, I guess. I also didn't see a teeth, but This thing was also ripped. I mean, through its scales, you could see its rippling muscles, all over its arms, all over its chest and stomach. I did not see any genitalia. It was not wearing any clothing or anything to cover that. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to go back in those woods to find out, if we're honest. In my early teens, my brother and I would always go out to the backwoods to hunt for treasure. We often implored the use of a metal detector. We found all sorts of cool but useless stuff in hindsight. Bottle caps, old knives, cans, forks, things like that. Nothing too exciting, but as a teenager, it was like striking gold. The adventure would usually start with us being out after dark, coming home muddy and exhausted. I mean, hey, it got us out into the woods and burned a lot of calories in the process. I guess this is why we always stayed in shape, which would come in handy for what would happen in this story. Let me just take a brief moment and explain the layout of the land. Our father owned a vast amount of acreage on the backside of our property. You had multiple creeks, and it kind of dipped down and you go further and further back, and then the land kind of goes up into a hill. Once you get to the top of this gradual slope, you could go back down again into a deeper section of valley that was all just forest upon forest. Now, during the fall season, my father would use these areas as hunting, and even had multiple deer stands set up all throughout there. My brother and I never really ventured that far out. I mean, we're talking hundreds of acres here. So, we generally stayed within maybe a mile or two at most of our own house. Don't quote me on the distance thing though. I really have no way to verify that measurement. It's just from my recollection. So, we often had this evening ritual. We'd be out there pretty much all day, playing and trying to look for stuff to hunt for treasure with, and of course, using our trusty metal detector. By about evening time, sometimes we would sit and relax, my brother and I, on top of the far back large hill, and just kind of hear the crickets slowly fade into the night, and see the weather and sky change. It was always really peaceful. Sometimes, well, more often than not, we would actually see foxes and deer. I can't dismiss it that it was really cool. But there was one night that I feel for me and my brother, but I can't speak for him. It kind of changed things. So we had a fairly normal day of hunting for treasure, and again, I don't believe we found anything extraordinary, at least not that I can recall. We were doing our usual of sitting atop this large hill, looking out into the night valley, or should I say almost night. That's when we started to hear sounds from the hill below us, something big moving around. My brother was the first one to hear it, as it got his attention first. He starts looking in that direction and knocks me on the shoulder, saying, "Hey, listen." And you could hear something big moving around. We thought it might be a buck or something, just due to the amount of noise it was making. But you could hear it was moving. And you could hear it wasn't walking, like the way a deer would. It was two-legged, whatever it was. And so now we're both really curious, trying to look through the trees and see if we can see anything. But we don't see anything. At this point, in the sky, it's pretty dusk. It's not totally blackout yet, but it's getting dark. And my brother and I were never afraid of walking back to the house at night, since we knew this part from the hill back to our house pretty well, and we were pretty hardy teenagers. We just kept thinking, there's no way somebody's back here. I mean, the only way to access it is you'd have to go all the way around, maybe another 40 or so acres in either direction. And quite frankly, if somebody was out here, they would have a lantern or some sort of flashlight. And there's really nothing out here. It's not hunting season. There's nothing of value. There's no reason why anybody should be back here. And the other thing is this movement sounded like it was coming from something very large, much bigger than just a man. All these thoughts are going through my head, and I'm sure my brother's at the same time. And we're looking, and we're looking. And then, My brother and I, at the same time in unison, see these red glowing eyes just appear down in the bottom of the hill, and they're moving up towards us. I believe again, my brother sees it first, and he hits me on the shoulder, and he says, "Look," and points. And we both see it. This figure, this tall figure is coming towards us with red eyes. I remember saying, "What is that?" And it gets closer and closer. And I think at this point, we were both so scared, we couldn't even get up to move. I know the natural instinct is to probably get up and run. But when you're that terrified, on a primal fear level, it's different. It grounds you in a way that you can't physically react like you're supposed to. It got closer and closer, till the shadows and darkness of the tree coverage became lighter and lighter, and we could start to make out what it was. It's almost like the lack of darkness allowed this thing to be illuminated by whatever little light there was supplied by the stars and the moon. My brother and I got a front row show to the horror of whatever this creature was, that certainly was far from anything human. And after seeing it with my own eyes, which I later verified with my brother in verbatim to make sure we saw the same thing, this looked like some sort of lizard alien thing. I'm not sure what else you'd call it, to be honest. But I can tell you, it had a flat face, slitted pupils, large red-yellow eyes, a very reptilian-shaped like head. It was very tall, not really built strong, full of muscles, like you would see in a bodybuilder, but more so very lanky in its torso and its arms and legs. And it had this large tail behind it. It was kind of like a large lizard man, I guess, if that's the best way to describe it. It never opened up its mouth, so I never saw any teeth. But I could tell that its face, like I said, was flat, and the nose had slits. It also never made any sounds, other than the crunching of leaves and coming up from the brush. It was maybe, 50 feet away from us, when my brother manages to jump up, grab me by the collar, and yank me and pull me. Somehow, like kick-starting a motor, that's all my legs needed in order to run back to the house. And at this point, it was dark. Maybe not pitch black, but darker. And the second we go running down the hill, back towards the slope up to our property, we can hear this thing now picking up its pace, chasing us, running behind us, and it's gaining quickly. Trust me, I did not look back. I know all about that. I was not going to risk that happen, and falling and tripping over a rock, and just being bait for whatever this thing was. Again, it never screamed or let any noise, just that it gave chase. We made it to the bottom of this hill, and the gradual slope back up to our house. I think it must have stopped either way, somewhere along before we hit the bottom, because afterwards, we didn't see it anymore, or hear it, and I really have no idea what it was. We'd made it back, just in time. Our parents weren't home, and so I didn't want to tell them anything anyway. I talked to my brother, asked him, "What do you think that was?" Because we both saw the same thing. We're not crazy, we didn't just see stuff. We did not hallucinate. That thing was as real as flesh and blood can get. And it's safe to say we didn't sleep that much that night. As terrified as I was from the whole experience, I tried to think analytically. Like, okay, this is obviously some sort of large predatory animal, bipedal or not. Then I start thinking about the logistics. Well, there's a lot of food back there. Tons of deer, tons of bear and foxes, lots of food, lots of places to go undisturbed and hide. If there's anywhere there would be some sort of creature like this, that backside of the property is exactly where you would find one. Although, I'm sure that my father has maybe had sightings himself, but he would never tell us, I'm sure. We had gone back there since multiple times, and yes, even at dusk, but we never saw this thing again. You might call me either brave or stupid for going back there, especially at dark. But, when you're a teenager, you think you're practically invincible, as we did. We felt that if we had a Bowie knife and the proper tools, we would be more equipped to handle a situation like that, which we kept on us all the time from that point forward, but never encountered it again, whatever it was. I was working the night shift in a remote gas station at the end of a highway. It was the middle of nowhere, and the only other people around were a group of raptors camping up the river. That night, around 1 in the morning, I was doing my bathroom weekly wipe down, and I stood in the middle of the bathroom and began to smell a very strange odor. It startled me. I kind of smelled it for just a minute and realized it was like that of rotting death or meat. So I looked up in search of the smell, but found nothing immediately. After stepping outside briefly, I looked around for any possible source, but I couldn't trace any. Then, just above me, I hear this whooshing sound, like something large flying directly overhead. I turn to look, and I see this dark black silhouette, shaped kind of like a giant bird or something, fly right overhead and fly right over the gas station. I'm thinking to myself, what did I just see? And I'm kind of stunned there in the moment, trying to process, is there some sort of giant owl or bird that flies around at night? Then it comes back again, this time flying over the gas station in the opposite direction. And this time, there was no mistaking what I saw. Attached to this thing were these 2 glowing red eyes as it flew directly overhead. Safe to say, I was terrified. As the only really attendant there, I ran back inside and hid. Because we're more of a rural gas station, really after about 10 or 11 p.m., our traffic flow really dies down. So I ran inside, locked the doors, and waited for maybe about 45 minutes before feeling safe enough to unlock them. I never saw really what it was close up, and whatever it was never flew down close enough for me to accurately see it. The rest of my shift would go on as pretty normal, and when I got off work the following day, I told a couple of my close friends what just happened. I'm not ashamed of it. I was outright open. They were actually pretty understanding and told me that, they said, man, it sounds like you had yourself a Mothman encounter. And I said, a what? And they're like, yeah, a Mothman. It's this demon owl cryptid that generally hangs around the West Virginia area, but it sounds like you had your own dose. Well, first off, I'm new to the whole concept of what a cryptid is, or creature, or being, whatever it is you call them. So, my good friend kindly redirected me right at you and told me, this guy right here, email him. He can help you get some answers and clarity. So that's exactly what I'm doing. And I'm wanting to ask you myself, did I see a Mothman? Or was this something else entirely? Maybe this was just a giant owl, and somehow the lights from the gas station caused its eyes to glow red. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of any rational explanation, because the logical thought of a Mothman actually coming near here, I don't know. It's just hard for me to process. Thank you for your time. This happened last summer, July of 2020. I have a pretty nice little house out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, it's a ways out in the countryside, but you know what? I enjoy it. So, one night, I'm sitting out on my porch, just enjoying the beautiful serenity that the night brings, smoking a cigarette. I'm lost in thought, thinking about whatever it was I was thinking about, and all of a sudden, I hear this giant thud, like something really heavy landed on the roof to my tiny house. Immediately, I shoot up and I'm looking around, and then, not even a few seconds later, I hear more thudding, as if whatever it was on my roof was now walking around. Now, I jump down off my porch to turn around and try to get a look at what had fallen on my roof. I turn, and to my horror, this being or thing was standing on my roof, looking at me. I'll do my best I can to describe it to you. It was a tall black silhouette with what appeared to be large bat wings or something, but they were kind of folded in. The body was a very weird shape. It was kind of human-esque, but it wasn't really like a head and body. It was just a body, if that makes sense. And it had two glowing red eyes, kind of tucked in between the wings, and it was staring at me. It wasn't a full moon out, so the visibility wasn't exactly the best. But as soon as I saw this thing, I dropped my cigarette. And for that split second in time, I had somehow managed to convince myself this is just a dream, you're hallucinating it, you need to go inside. But then, before I could even finish that trail of thought, this thing opens its wings and shoots off into the night sky, disappearing completely. Safe to say, I ran inside, locking my door, not going out for the remainder of the night. The next morning, I get up and go out there, and, of course, this thing was nowhere to be found. No traces of it, nothing. I mean, I guess with the events that transpired, I didn't really expect there to be any evidence or traces, but I don't know. Maybe in the moment, I just felt like observing my surroundings would hopefully give me some sort of closure. That maybe it was just a dream, maybe I just hallucinated it. So, I decided to take my encounter to the internet. I tried to do some researching and see what I could not find. Well, unfortunately, what I experienced was not a hallucination. Turns out, what I think I saw is something called the Mothman, originating from Point Pleasant. I had no idea this thing was even a thing, or it even existed. I don't know if it's a being or a demon or some sort of animal, but whatever it was, it terrified me, and I haven't seen it since, and I don't ever want to see it again. This isn't my story. It's actually a family friend's, so I'll change the names, just to keep their identity safe. Basically, a group of these teenagers were on a camping trip when they were attacked by this winged being, or a supernatural force, and they were basically forced to find the way to escape. My friend, or my father's friend, Kenny, was always the adventurous type, and wanted his kids to experience the great outdoors and all it had to offer. So, his son and his friends were convinced that they can handle doing a little camping and hiking, even if it bled into the night. Well, they were wrong. They had barely been on the trail for a day when strange things had begun to happen. First off, it wasn't too long into the trip when they all picked up on the feeling they were being followed by something. They couldn't tell what. It was just some sort of presence. Then, they hear the sound of twigs snapping and things like that. Something large in the trees watching them very closely. As a matter of fact, before even nightfall began, one of the kids thought they saw a strange, shadowy creature, and before they knew it, they were convinced they were being hunted. They turned to see a dark figure flying through the trees, sitting on one of the high-end branches, and it appeared to have red eyes, watching them, keeping track of their every movement. It appeared to be getting closer and closer each time, and they all felt it was going to attack them. Somehow, the kids managed to make a little makeshift campsite. They were planning on roughing it out through the night, and after a while, they looked at each other in confusion and wondered, why are they trying to do this? They should leave. They were also wondering if this was just some collective nightmare, and they needed to be more careful. They decided, we need to leave and get out of here. That night, this thing came into their campsite. That night, this thing pretty much enters their camp before they get a chance to disassemble, scaring them all to death. I guess it had tried attacking one of the kids, trying to grab them with its talons and pick them up. They all fled, screaming, leaving their couple tents and any equipment they had behind. They all grabbed whatever gear they could and ran as fast as they could in unison. Just when they thought they were safe, this dark figure was following them. They finally found a place to hide, but they had to keep moving. They had to find their way out of the woods. They finally saw a light and realized it appeared to be a cabin close by the road, and they ran as fast as they could. This thing was now pursuing them through the trees, chasing them. They were in a portion of woods that had a lot of thick fir trees, so movement was kind of limited. They said they could hear this thing jumping through the trees, watching them, coming after them, like it wasn't trying to come down and swoop at them, but just keep track of them, like it was waiting. The kids kept looking behind them and saw that this thing was getting closer and closer, as if it was leading them to trap them. So, after a few hours of this going on, the kids had lost hope, but managed, even though they were exhausted, tired, and hungry, managed to make it to some back road they didn't know existed, just in the nick of time to hear somebody driving by. It was a lone trucker, and they knew that was the sound they had been waiting for. It was the sound of an approaching truck. They waved the trucker down, and he managed to be able to pull over and help these poor kids out. They were now freed, and their father came and gave them all a ride. This was back in 1977, and they still don't really talk about the experience. They don't know what followed them. They're all convinced it was some sort of creature. I thought the story is an interesting one, since I've been told it for a long time, and it's part of my family friend story. So I wanted to find out for them. You seem to know a lot about monsters and creatures. What do you think it was? Please, read this story in its entirety. The events are chronological to the best of my ability, and the reason I am posting this is because I think people who will read it will find this absolutely fascinating. I'm not a believer, but I am a hearer of the strange. I've spent a lot of time in Western Virginia and have been to every major area of sightings. I am familiar with the lore, but never have been able to come across any real information. I am posting this because it may be of value to somebody. I have nothing to gain by posting this, and there is no attention or intention to try to cash in on the situation. I just feel that this is one of the most fascinating things I could have ever had happen, and I hope somebody else out there feels the same. I want to share this. So, this has been hard to type. It's been amazing but very emotional for me, and I want to do my best to recreate the events as they occurred. I will try to post this story verbatim as best I can. This happened on the night of Friday, January 16th, 2015. It was a very cold and windy night, and I was about to head to bed. I was on my couch with my wife and my dog, and we were watching a movie. About 10:30 or 11 p.m. rolls around, and I tell my wife I'm going to bed. I am a big-time insomniac, so I don't go to bed that early. I was looking out my living room window, and there was a big snowstorm coming in. The wind was whipping, and you could see the snow being blown by the wind. The temperature was below freezing. I closed the curtains and headed to my bedroom. As I'm walking down the hall, I hear a thumping noise coming from my back door, followed by a whistling noise. I went to the door, opening it up, and immediately see this thing just outside my door, maybe 25 to 30 feet away from it. And it was night, so I couldn't make out every detail, but I could see it was kind of a grayish dark color. It was big, black, and had kind of a pointed beak and very large red eyes. It stood almost upright, but kind of at a slanted angle, and appeared to have what I can describe as wings on its back. It was very large. It was much taller than an average man, although I cannot give you a height estimate. I did not see that it had any ears or other facial details, but I could see that it was breathing and was looking straight at me. Not even 2 seconds later, this thing takes off straight up into the air at a very high rate of speed. As it went up, it makes a whistling sound, and you could see its wings moving really fast. As I see it go up, the moonlight kind of fades. So that's it. I closed my door and I was done. Unsure of what I just saw, I go back and tell my wife, and I say, "Honey, I just saw something up there I can't explain." And she could tell something was wrong. I was ghastly pale. Something was very wrong. I have no way to try and explain away what I saw, and it's honestly a mystery. While part of me wants to believe and accept that this was a Mothman encounter, part of me also wants to believe and accept it was something else entirely. What? I'm not sure. I live in Mason County, West Virginia, in the Mason-Mingo Junction area. I have 2 Mothman sightings in my entire life. The first was in 1992 to 1993. I was roughly 8 or 9 years old, and at this time, it was evening, and I was just getting out of the shower. Because of where our shower was in the house, I had to go and use my parents' shower. Theirs was really the only operable one at the time. So I'm getting out of the shower, getting dressed in my parents' bedroom. When out the window, I see this figure land and dart into this tree. The movement just naturally catches my attention, and I walk over the window to go and look. Standing, perched on top of this tree, is what I thought was a large bat at first, but the more I looked, even at that age, I just knew it wasn't right. Something was so wrong about it. The way it looked, the way it moved just seemed unnatural. The way it furled its wings inward. Then, it immediately looked over in my direction, as if it knew I was watching it. I remember kind of just gasping and stepping back. This thing immediately darts down to the ground and kind of vanishes into a small sect of trees. Completely startled by this, I get dressed fully, go downstairs, and tell my mom what I just saw. She, of course, being a mom, simply dismisses any claims I would have had and just says, "Oh, honey, you probably saw an owl or a bird. Nothing to be alarmed of." But I wasn't buying her explanation. Even though I was 8 or 9, I wasn't stupid. I knew what an owl or bird looked like, and my mom trying to cheaply explain it away wasn't doing it justice. So, a couple of days later, I was very close with my grandfather at the time, so I brought my encounter story to him. He believed me. Oh yes. As a matter of fact, he's seen the Mothman too, multiple times, even going as far back as being a young boy before the infamous grouping of sightings back in the 60s. He tells me that these things, that there's not just one of them, but there's several of them. They hang around the area and they mainly stay in the woods, and to mainly try and just stay out of the woods at night if you can. But I told him I wasn't in the woods, I was in the house. And he responded by telling me that even though I wasn't in the woods when this happened, we're close by, and to just try my best to stay away from not only wooded areas, but any areas around wooded areas, just to try and stay safe. There's no telling what these things are capable of, and if anything, they're probably extremely dangerous. Alright, now let me tell you a bit about my second encounter. For this one, we fast forward in time about 10 or so years. I was now 19 years old and had a part-time job working at a lumber mill. Because of where we lived at the time, we were a little bit ways out of town, and this lumber mill was roughly 6 miles away from my house. To get there, you had to take a lot of back roads, which meant coming back at night, I had to be very cautious of deer. I mean, the area was full of black-tailed deer, constantly having times where they'd jump out in front of your car. So, naturally, it being nighttime and with that in mind, I was always on very high alert. So I'm driving home, it's dark, it's maybe sometime in the spring or fall. I can't remember which, but it was roughly 7 or 8 p.m. Like I said, it was dark, and I'm driving these roads, and I come to a fork in the road. I make a right turn to lead back to my house. Now, I'm maybe 3 miles away, and as I'm coming down the straight road, this figure I see is standing right in the middle of the road. And as I'm pulling up to it, I'm thinking to myself, who's standing in the road? But things begin to get a little bit more unnerving. The closer I get, the more closer my headlights start to illuminate this figure. And like normal, if it was a person, the headlights would start to reveal details of the person. Like what they looked like, their clothing, etc. The only problem here is, the more the lights hit this thing, nothing showed. It was just pitch black, like there were no details at all, as if it was some formulated physical cloud of black smoke, is how I can best describe it. So I'm getting closer and closer to this thing and just trying to rationalize and make out what I'm looking at. I couldn't tell you the exact second that my brain just had that aha moment, where it clicked that I had seen enough of this thing to fully have that flashback memory of the same thing I saw 10 years prior. And immediately, that recognition was horrific. This thing opened its wings, revealing the same two eyes that I saw when I was 8 or 9, and I knew instantly, this is the same creature. I want to say I thought about it and made a very intelligent reaction, but what I recall is my body just reacting to the sighting, and I slam on my brakes, no more than 50 feet away from this thing, contesting my driving further down the road. And without even thinking the thought, I throw my car into reverse, do a quick 180, and I'm zooming in the opposite direction, not even caring to check my rearview mirrors. In that moment in time, my only motive was to make as much distance between me and this thing as possible. Yeah, I took the long way home, which took an extra 20-25 minutes, but it was worth it. I never did tell my mother or my grandfather at that point what I saw. Not this point. Now, fast forward another few years, and I'm about 23. I had finally saved up enough money to move out on my own and away and out of town. Well, since then, I've had a budding career, and fortunately for me, I've had 0 encounters, sightings, or experiences with this, what people I guess call the Mothman. But they do at least make interesting stories now that I've made peace with them. So I'm happy to share them with you. Use them as freely as you want. Just please keep my name out of this. Thanks. Hello. I am a private detective in Denton, Texas. I have a sighting I would like to share with you that took place back in August of 1999. I was sent to a residence in Denton County to do an investigation for a child custody case. I was sent there to do a check on the welfare of a person who was supposed to be living in the residence. I arrived at about 7 p.m. and went inside to make my investigation. While in the residence, I was startled by a noise coming from the back. I went to the back and found a 5-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes in the backyard, and I observed as this thing climbed up a pine tree and flew off with what appeared to be large bat-like wings. It moved very fast and very gracefully, kind of like it just glided across the sky. It was incredibly unusual. Of course, I reached out to local law enforcement, but they said they get these reports more often than not, and there's nothing they could do. I'm not really the one to share and talk about paranormal sightings and happenings, but I have been a fan of your channel for a while now, and I figured that you might enjoy this little nugget. I've never really understood what it was, or why it was there, or what its purpose was. All I can say is that I guess I'm a part of the lucky club that actually has had the fortune, or depending on how you look at it, misfortune, of seeing something like this in person. This sighting occurred right around the summer of 2001. I was out in the woods with my boyfriend at the time, camping. It was a wonderful, peaceful night. Very clear. We were just sitting out looking at the stars together. It was about maybe 11 to 11:30 p.m. It was now getting pretty late. I had just finished telling my boyfriend that I was tired and was ready to check in for bed in the tent, when I noticed something moving quickly through the trees. I looked to my left and saw a being. Now, I don't know what it is, and I don't claim to know what it was, but I've never seen anything like it before. It was maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and had red eyes. I could not tell if it had wings or not, but it moved extremely fast and was very agile. I just remember thinking to myself, what is that? Could it be a bear? It had very long arms and was running on two legs. It ran by us so fast that I couldn't make out details on the face, but I can tell you, judging by its stature, size, the way it moved, it was impossible for it to be a human. I mean, it was so dark out there. Why would anybody be doing this? We were startled. At least I was. I told my boyfriend what I saw, and to come find out, he saw the same thing too. He just didn't want to say anything to me to scare me. He said he saw the same thing and that it was very fast, but like he could only make out a faint silhouette. That was more than enough for him. I am 100% sure that what I saw was not a human. I don't know what it was, and I have never seen a bear move like that before, assuming it is a bear. I've heard of things called a Mothman, but I don't know. It could also, I guess, be a Bigfoot, but I'm not really into Bigfoot, or the idea that one exists. In fact, the idea is silly to me, but I clearly can't deny what we experienced on this camping trip. Either way, I don't want to come to any conclusions just yet. I think I'd rather wait for your opinion. You tell me, what do you think I saw? As I was driving back home from work, and as I was almost home, I got off the exit for the street that I live on. As I slowed down at the off-ramp, I see these two huge red eyes catching my attention. I looked at it, and it looked at me. I sped away as quickly as I could. It was bigger than a man, and it had wings. It was black, and it didn't have a head. I usually don't believe the stories that people tell that this thing is the Mothman. But, based on what I saw, how could I say no? I'm not sure if I could call myself a believer in Mothman, but I do believe in extraterrestrials. I've seen this with my own eyes, and I know for a fact it was real. The creature did not look like a human being. It did not look like anything that I've seen before. It came soaring out of the sky right at my car, and had I not slowed down, I probably would have hit it. I'll never forget what I saw. I'm kind of still in shock over it, honestly. I know the Mothman is something talked about and seen by so many of the locals, but I never in a million years could have imagined that I myself would see it. I've seen many strange things in my life, but this was the most bizarre thing I have ever seen. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. It was no dream. I wish it was. I know many others see this thing too, so I know I'm not crazy. I was lying in bed at about 2 a.m. after staying up pretty late. That's when I noticed this very large shadow just outside my window. It immediately caught my attention. I live next to a really large lake out here in the woods, so I wasn't sure what it was. It was much larger than a deer, like I initially thought. I was convinced at first it was a deer, but then I noticed it was standing upright. So I opened my window further to see this huge black creature, which then I noticed it had a very large wingspan, and it was hovering over the lake. This thing looked to be bigger than a human, but its head was shaped kind of like a dome, like a large black moth. I only saw it for a few seconds, but even in the dark and the dim moonlight, I locked right onto it, noticing that it looked all sorts of wrong. This was something not of the natural world. And its eyes. There was something wrong with the eyes. They seemed to illuminate red, glowing this faint light. It was all black, pitch black, and it had long wings. It seemed to kind of sit there for a few seconds and then kind of shoot off in the distance, disappearing between the trees. I was convinced that maybe was this a Bigfoot, although I don't know anything about Bigfoot. Do Bigfoot have wings? Do they even live in the woods? I don't know. I didn't hear any other movement. I didn't smell anything. I didn't notice anything else that was strange. Just that sight. And for the record, from where I'm sitting in bed, if you look out the window, I have a perfect view of the lake, which, mind you, is only maybe 50 feet away from my bedroom. So, if there's any movement out there, I'm gonna see it. And the way the moon was positioned that night, right up in the right spot in the sky, gave me the perfect illumination of this being or object that was just hovering there. Look, I'm like you. I wish I could give you a proper explanation of what it was or what it could have been, but I really don't know. So I've taken the time to write this encounter up and send it to several people. You, of course, being one of them, and the replies I'm getting back are a little unnerving. I guess somebody had mentioned something about a demon, while somebody else mentioned something about a Mothman. Now, I took the time to do some research before I send you an email, and come to find out, the Mothman is this, what they call a cryptid, and it normally exists in western Virginia, and I guess was even responsible for a ton of disasters around Point Pleasant. And while yeah, the concept is very interesting, I'm just not 100% sure I'm fully convinced yet. Although, I do believe and I know I saw something, but what that something was, I'm not too sure. So, in my search for the answer, I stumbled upon you. You seem to be the kingdom of encounters and stories, and hopefully knowledge that will solve this case. If you can't, well, I'm hoping you'll at least read this and maybe your viewers will be able to crack the case. And maybe, if I'm lucky, you'll put this up online and I can read people's comments. That's if you choose to read this. Anyhow, in closing, I appreciate your efforts and any responses you give. Thank you for your time.